Have you ever tried putting a puzzle together without the box top? It's incredibly frustrating to me. Like, one of the reasons why I like doing puzzles is not so much finding the puzzle piece and putting it into the puzzle, it's with the box top, finding the puzzle piece where it goes before I even look at everything. So getting down there in the nitty-gritty and trying to figure out where the puzzle fits with the box top. Without the box top, I'm miserable. I don't enjoy doing puzzles that way. Well, for some people, the book of Ezekiel is like trying to put together a puzzle without the box top. It's a very difficult task. In fact, in the lead up of the last few weeks and the last few months, when I have let a few of our church members know where I was going next after Mark, I would share with them that I was praying and seeking the Lord, and that the Lord was laying on my heart to go to the major prophet Ezekiel. And typically the response was one of two responses. I've never heard a pastor preach that, or I read that recently and that's a really difficult book. Well, brothers and sisters, take heart. You are not the first person to think it is a difficult book. In fact, Jerome, the church father Jerome, 900 years after this was written, wrote about the Jews when they'd studied this book. They forbade any man who was under 30 years old from studying this book from the beginning to the end. You had to be over 30 before you were allowed to formally study this for the Jews during Jerome's day. In fact, the difficulties were such that one rabbi, his name was Hananiah ben Hezekiah, was given rations of food and oil for 300 days, and he was locked in a room to go figure out how all the puzzle pieces fit together in the book of Ezekiel. Well, brothers and sisters, one of the difficulties that Hananiah ben Hezekiah had, and that all of these other Jews had, is that they were trying to put the puzzle pieces together without the box top. The box top of the fulfillment of Jesus Christ. And so you and I have a better position today as we approach this. And we are a people of the book, because it is in this book that God has revealed himself to us. We as Christians, we are committed to the final fulfillment of the revelation of God in the Bible in and through God's Son, Jesus Christ. He is the image of God. He is the exact representation of his nature. All the fullness of the deity dwells bodily in Jesus Christ. And as a church, we are deeply committed to unfolding the glory of Jesus Christ week in and week out. We've just finished a 9-month study through the Gospel of Mark. Prior to this time, our church has walked through the book of Acts, Philippians, Hebrews, 1 John. We have studied the books of the New Testament, and we've gone deep in them. So why now should a church devote its time of 8, 9, 10 months to study a very long Old Testament prophet? Maybe by now you've opened up to Ezekiel 1 and you flipped over a few pages and you realize that Ezekiel wasn't just like 5 chapters. It wasn't like the book of Ruth. Ruth is the most common Old Testament book preached because it's only 4 chapters. It's nice for a month. If you keep on flipping, this is one of the longest books in the Bible. And we as a church, committed to being a people of the book, I'm committed to leading us through that way. Why should you know about Ezekiel's prophecies? Why should you care? That's what this sermon is about today. We're only covering 3 verses. It's an introduction to the book of Ezekiel, and it's going to hopefully center by the end of the book to give you an appetite for studying this along with us. We're going to do something unique in our life groups this week. We are actually going to read together a fourth of the book out loud. We're going to read the first 11 chapters of Ezekiel. So we're not answering many questions, only got 1 or 2, but we're just going to read together. So hopefully this sermon preps us to read God's word and come into encounter it. But here is the simplest answer that I can give to you. one of the best ways to treasure the glory of the fulfillment of Jesus Christ, instituting for us a new covenant relationship with God, is to comprehend and apprehend and appreciate the progression of the failure of the people under the old covenant. One of the best ways for you to treasure what it means to be in a new covenant relationship with God is to grasp the desperate nature of the people when they failed under the old covenant. And then to hear of the promise. You see, the book of Ezekiel is going to tell us about the new covenant at the end. It's going to give us the promise that one day God would come and would change the people from the inside out. Secondary answer as to why I've been led here for our church family is that the experience of the people of God during the days of Ezekiel is not an uncommon experience for Christians today. What I mean by that is, in Ezekiel's day, the people of God lived in suffering and tumult in exile. They were not in their home. And indeed, in these days, I fear that far too many Christians think this place is their home. And they don't grasp the reality that we are sojourners and strangers. And we are not longing for a city that is here, but we are longing for a city to come, as we read in our call to worship in Hebrews 13. And the book of Ezekiel will teach us what it means to live as exiles and to long for the glory of God. Here's our big idea for this morning's sermon. Big idea for this morning is that Ezekiel teaches us how to live in a world that is not our home. Yet, it will be one day when He remakes everything in the new heavens and the new earth. But right now, this is not our home. And while we do that, we're going to live while beholding God's glory in salvation through judgment. First, here in our sermon, if you pull out your sermon notes, I have two introductions today, an introduction 1 and an introduction 2. And what that means is I want to introduce where Ezekiel fits in the storyline of the Bible, the big storyline of God. And then we're going to focus right in on Ezekiel and try to unfold Ezekiel for us today. So here is the storyline of the entire Bible summed up in 6 words. 6 words can sum up the storyline of the entire Bible. So I think you can learn these 6 words with me today, okay? So everyone put up your 6 fingers. Here are the 6 words. The storyline of the Bible is God's glory in salvation through judgment. Try that with me. God is one. All right, try that with me. God's glory in salvation through judgment. Let me break that down for us. Let me break that down. The Bible begins by telling us that God created the world for His glory. All things are to be done for the glory of God. We were created in His image to have a relationship with Him so that we could magnify our Creator. We would amplify His glory among His creation as we bore His image forth. And we took it as we spread out across the world. As Adam and Eve were intended to have children, to be fruitful and multiply. Everywhere they went, they were to take the image of God and He was to be glorified because of it. But the design of the world was not just for God to be glorified as its creator. No, indeed, God purposely designed this world to demonstrate His glory through the redemption of His people by saving them. Therefore, God is glorified as His people's creator and as His people's redeemer. So God, and in His infinite goodness, permitted Satan to introduce sin and rebellion into the world. Satan was not outside the sovereign hand of God when God permitted him into the garden. God had the power to keep him out, and He allowed Satan to enter in because it was through that sin that mankind would fall. Indeed, in the garden, the ancient serpent was permitted to intrude upon the very good creation of God and to sow that reckless discord that would produce in the hearts of Adam and Eve the rebellion that would come about as they doubted God. They doubted God's goodness. They doubted God's provision. They considered equality with God as something that they could grasp. And therefore, their disastrous sin set the stage for their desperate need of salvation. God's glory would be displayed through the salvation He would bring His people. And God's grand salvation would be accomplished as it was set on the backdrop of God's judgment. God's grand salvation would be set on a backdrop of God's judgment. Just like when you go diamond shopping, they take that diamond and they place it upon the backdrop of a black cloth so that the glory of the facets of that diamond can shine forth. So God set His great salvation on the backdrop of His wrath. His wrath in the Garden of Eden was poured out on Adam and Eve's sin by exiling them from His presence. He sent them away from Him in the garden. His judgment revealed His glory because God is absolutely holy and He cannot dwell with those who sin. But against the backdrop of that judgment, God provided a brilliant diamond of hope right there in the Garden of Eden. Genesis 3:15, God promised salvation would come one day through a human being born of a woman. The question that stands behind the entire narrative of the Old Testament is, who is that human being? Who is that one that was promised to come, that would come from the seed of the woman, and he would crush the head of the serpent? Who was the boy that was born to die? But one big question was whether there was any other possible way to save the world from their sin. So could it be possible to restart the world without sin if God were to simply judge all of the wicked people? So in Genesis 6, God's glory was revealed by judging all of the wicked people. The world was judged by a worldwide flood. God's floodwaters of wrath baptized the whole world. And on the backdrop of that judgment, God's glorious salvation shined forth. A tiny diamond floated in the waters of His wrath. An ark saved Noah and his family. God decreed anew to Noah. Once they landed, He told Noah to be fruitful and multiply, just like He told Adam and Eve. It was like a new creation was to begin. But just as soon as those words came off of God's lips, Noah found himself entering into a garden, taking up the fruit of the vine, getting drunk, and getting naked. Just as Adam and Eve sinned, so too Noah sinned. Judgment that fell against the earth couldn't change the heart of Noah and his family. Judgment alone could not bring about their salvation. The story then would advance into Genesis chapter 11 and the beginning of 12, when God sovereignly chose a man named Abram. He's a man that lived in a land called Ur of the Chaldeans. It's modern-day Iraq. And entered into a covenant with him. And all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. You see, the seed of the woman promised in Genesis 3, that would come from a lineage of any family on earth, anyone that comes from Adam and Eve, it would now be narrowed. It would come from the lineage of Abraham. He would be the promised son, the son of Abraham, to whom, while he was living outside of the land, God brought Abraham into His promised land. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. But to demonstrate that this righteousness came by faith alone, the biblical narrative shows that Abraham was no mere perfect man. Indeed, the promise alone couldn't cleanse the sin that was in Abraham's heart. Immediately after hearing this, Abraham attempted to bring about the fulfillment of the promise on his own. And so Abraham sinned and slept with his concubine Hagar and had a son named Ishmael. But Ishmael was not the son of the promise, and God would miraculously open the womb of his wife Sarah and provide her a son, Isaac. Abraham's family would continue this mixture of faithfulness and unfaithfulness until ultimately the people found themselves outside the land again. They found themselves oppressed in a foreign land of Egypt. And there, God's mighty right arm to save his people would raise up. Through the Exodus, he would come and he would split the Red Sea in two. And as the Israelites would pass through the waters, they would experience God's glory of salvation in the context of his judgment. This time, his judgment would befall the Egyptians. The flood waters would fall against the entire Egyptian army and wipe them out. And then God brought them out of the land of Egypt, and they came to Mount Sinai, where God would enter into a covenant with the people through his servant Moses. We call this the Mosaic covenant. In the New Testament, it is referenced as the Old Covenant. It was here at Mount Sinai that God would say, I am your God and you are my people. This would clarify that the son of the woman promised in Genesis 3 would come from not just any human being in the world, and it wouldn't just come from anybody in the lineage of Abraham. Remember, there's Ishmael or Isaac. No, it would come from an Israelite. You see, an Israelite would be that one that would come, that would fulfill God's law perfectly. But the law couldn't cleanse the sin in their hearts. Indeed, before Moses even got his feet down from the end of the mountain, the people immediately were sinning against God and prostrating themselves down, playing the harlot before the golden calf. The law couldn't remove the sin from the people's hearts. Ultimately, the sin of this generation led them to be judged for 40 years, and all of them died off in the wilderness before they were allowed to enter into the promised land. Joshua called the people to absolute fidelity to God. That's what we read this morning from Joshua chapter 1, to be bold and to choose this day to follow the Lord. But as they were to be called to follow the Lord and enter into the land, the people would continue to rebel and not keep God's word. As they entered the land and were commanded by God to conquer all of the land and to kick all of the inhabitants out, they refused to obey. And in due time, the people entered into a descending spiral of cycles of rebellion against God. Every time this cycle would come up, God would judge his people. And he would judge them severely by bringing in a foreign army to come and to conquer them. And then the people would turn and cry out to God, and then God would raise up a hero. We call that hero by the name a judge. There were 12 of them in all, but in the midst of all of these judges, there was a descending spiral happening for the people. They kept on getting more and more and more wicked until the end of the book of Judges. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes because there was no king in Israel. And so the people had rejected God as their king at this point. Naturally, the next thing they decided is that they wanted their own king. And so they demanded that God give them a king like all the other nations, because they looked around and saw the Philistines had a king. They looked around and saw the Egyptians had their pharaohs, and they said, we need a king to protect us. But in the midst of saying that, they rejected God as their king. This grave sin against God put Israel on a disastrous path. Now, God always intended for his people to have a righteous king over them, but not a king like the other worldly nations. And so Saul, Israel's first king, sinned gravely, and he was removed from the throne. But then Then God sovereignly chose a man after his own heart to take the throne. God called David, and he placed him on Saul's throne, and he made a covenant with him in 2 Samuel 7, that one day one of David's sons would inherit the throne forever. You see, the son of the woman promised in Genesis 3 would be a son of Abraham, he would be a son of Israel, and now he would be a son of David. He would be a king who would perfectly represent God's people, and he would keep the Mosaic covenant perfectly. He would be a king that would come. But just like Abraham and Moses before him, David likewise proved to not be a perfect man, and he committed grave sin against God. You see, the kingship alone couldn't keep the human heart from sinning against God. The first son of David to sit on the throne, Solomon, he would start out gloriously. He was responsible for the building of the temple and dedicating it to the Lord. But he would end his reign less like a king of Israel and more like a Pharaoh of Egypt, as he multiplied wives, as he entrusted himself to chariots and to the riches. And because of Solomon's sin, the kingdom would be split into two, and with the 10 tribes of the north going into Israel, and the 2 tribes of the south forming Judah. For the next 200 years, all 20 kings of the 10 tribes of the north, all 20 kings did what was wicked in the sight of the Lord. And 200 years later, God would bring a grave judgment against those 10 northern tribes. He would bring the foreign superpower of the Assyrians from the north to devastate the land and to exile all of the inhabitants. But the Assyrians' policy was to take the inhabitants that they would conquer and to disperse them all across their empire. And then they would take other places that they conquered and they would disperse them back into the land. And as a result, there was never a recovery for the 10 northern tribes. In 722 BC, it was the last moment for these tribes of Israel to exist. Now, the 2 southern tribes of Judah, they only fared moderately better. During the time the northern tribes of Israel were being exiled, God sent his prophet Isaiah to warn Judah of the devastating consequences of rebelling against God. A few godly kings would intermittently lead Judah with reforms seeking to obey the Lord, with the last godly king being Josiah. Josiah would find the book of the law in the temple, and he would lead this great recovery of worship of God. But in the midst of this time, the Assyrians were starting to lose their power, and the Babylonians were starting to gain power. And therefore, the Assyrians, no longer the superpower, turned to Egypt to try to get help from Egypt. And an Egyptian pharaoh, Necho, decided he would come help the Assyrians, and on his way to go fight the Babylonians, he crossed right through the territory of Judah. And on the battlefield in Megiddo, Josiah was killed in 609 BC, the last godly king of Judah. Josiah's son, Jehoahaz, took the throne for all of 3 months before he was deposed by the Pharaoh. And then one of his brothers, Jehoiakim, was put in his place. Jehoiakim did what was wicked in the sight of the Lord. In the midst of this time, Jeremiah the prophet is prophesying, warning God's people, don't do this. Don't go down this path. God's judgment is going to come against you. But Jehoiakim had no interest in listening to the prophet of God. He listened to false prophets who came and said, peace, peace. But there was no peace. Jehoiakim rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar came in 598 BC, and he laid siege against the city of Jerusalem. 3 months before the siege was finished, Jehoiakim died, and his 18-year-old son, Jehoiachin, took his throne. But then Nebuchadnezzar completed his siege 3 months later, and he deposed Jehoiachin, the last Davidic king on the throne. After him, he took Jehoiachin's uncle, Zedekiah, and he placed him on the throne, but he was just a puppet king. He was more like a governor. And Jehoiachin was marched off into exile in 598 with 8,000 of the leading men of Judah, and Ezekiel was one of those in their midst. Ezekiel is a man that is marched off into exile. Split from his land. He's about a 25-year-old priest. And he's going to prophesy in between this time of marched off into exile before the city of Jerusalem in 587 ultimately gets burned to the ground. He's going to prophesy. Jeremiah prophesies during this time while he's in Judah. Ezekiel's going to prophesy during this time while he's in exile. But what is it that we can learn from this story? The story is this. God has made a promise that one day He's going to crush Satan's head. And in the midst of this promise, the Old Testament has unfolded that Satan's head is not going to be crushed by mere judgment falling against all the people, the wicked people. The sin in people's hearts not going to be exiled by promises. The sin's not going to be exiled by covenants. The sin's not going to be exiled by laws. The sin's not going to be exiled by kings. It's going to take something more. It's going to take something that changes them from the inside out. You see, Ezekiel's going to prophesy about this time of judgment that's going to happen against them, but the end of Ezekiel is going to prophesy about a future time in which God would make a promise of a new covenant, in which He would change the people to their core. He would remove the heart of stone in them and put in them a heart of flesh. And He's going to do that in and through that one seed of the woman. The one that could come from someone from humanity. The one that could come from Abraham's line. The one that would come from Israel. The one that would come from the son of David, the Messiah. He would be the one that would institute the new covenant for His people. Now, second thing I want you to see this morning. Second thing, real quick, is I want you to see, if you have your notes, I want you to see the structure of the book of Ezekiel. Remember, it was really tough for the Jews and everyone scratched their head. I think this helps. The book of Ezekiel is divided into two halves. The first half of the book deals with God's glory in judgment, as God judges Israel. The second half of the book deals with God's glory in salvation, as He brings hope for the future. Now, in the middle of the book, there is a big swing transition. There's a swing transition, and it's marked out. Chapter 24 ends all of God's word of judgment against Israel. So the first half of the book, judgment against Israel for their sin. It ends there at chapter 24 with a word, the parable here, a word that Israel or Jerusalem is about to fall. And that because Jerusalem is about to fall, no longer will He talk about God judging Israel. This section gets matched in chapter 33 with the actual report that Jerusalem has fallen. And so Ezekiel writes, providing for us a word that is about to fall, and it is fallen. And what's in between is a word of judgment, so it's like the first half of the book, but it's not a judgment against the people anymore. It's now a judgment against God's enemies. So the middle of the book is these judgments against Egypt and all of the enemies of God. But then after the report that that Jerusalem has fallen, everything changes. Chapter 34 shifts the entire book, and it shifts us to thinking about God's glory in salvation through the hope of the new covenant. Indeed, what we're going to see is we're going to see that this book is a book of God's glory. It's a book of dry bones, of dead people, dead bones, but then it's a book about new hearts and what God can do in us. Well, I want us to see just quickly these first three verses and how this introduces for us the book of Ezekiel. Here in verse 1, we see is in Ezekiel's 30th year, while in exile in Babylon, he saw visions of God and His glory. Verse 1 reads, in the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, while I was among the exiles by the Chebar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. begins by saying in the 30th year, and it doesn't describe the 30th year of what? Typically, in the Old Testament, you would describe the 30th year of the reigning king. It would either be the foreign power or your king, and it would be from when he started to reign. You might also take it from some significant event, but that's likely not what's going on here. What I think is happening here is Ezekiel is beginning this book by marking the 30th year of his life. He's 30 years old when this happens to him. Ezekiel writes in the first person that on the 5th day of the 4th month, he's sitting among the exiles in Babylon next to the Kabar or Chebar Canal. And something incredible happens to him. Now, why is 30 significant for Ezekiel? Because as a 25-year-old man, Ezekiel was carried away from his home. And not only was he a 25-year-old man, he was a 25-year-old priest, we find out. This is a man who was training his whole life to be a priest in the temple of God. And guess how old you had to be to begin your service? 30 years old. This man is sitting, meditating on all of his lost out hopes of his life. He had devoted his life for this one task. And now he is in a foreign land wondering this very question. Where is God? Where is He? Where are you, God? Why have you allowed this to happen to my life? And do you know what God answers? You know how God answers? He rips open the heavens in front of him and he gives him a vision that God is exactly present with him in Babylon. This man is a living proof of Joshua's promise, I'll never leave you or forsake you. Of Jesus' promise, I'll never leave you or forsake you. Listen, God goes with His people. And Ezekiel shows us this over and over and over again. That's why we read from chapter 1 and chapter 8 and chapter 40 earlier. It's visions of the glory of God and God's hand directing His people in the midst of Babylon. In the midst of this land that was separate. They no longer had a temple, but they had the glory of God. And the glory of God was good enough. And that's what they see right here. Where is God, the exiles ask? God reveals Himself to be right with His people. But next I want you to see verse 2 and 3. It's a second sort of an introduction. It's in King Jehoiachin's 5th year of exile that the Lord's hand was on the exiles, and the Lord's word came directly to Ezekiel to speak. So verse 2 reads, on the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of King Jehoiachin's exile, the word of the Lord came directly to the priest Ezekiel, son of Buzi. And in the land of Chaldeans, by the Chebar Canal, the Lord's hand was on him there. So this is a second introduction. It's likely inserted by Ezekiel later on or by an editor here. You notice there was a shift from first person in verse 1 to a third person in verse 2 and 3. And what it does is it's going to explain what was meant by the 30th year. And he's going to give us an exact date. 5 years from Jehoiachin being exiled, the 4th month, the 5th day. We know this date exactly. It's July 31st, 593 BC. We can pinpoint this to a number. That means we also know that Ezekiel was a 25-year-old man when he went into exile as a priest. So, what's interesting here is we noted earlier, typically dates are sent from the reign of a king. Normally, dates aren't sent from the time in which a king got sent off into exile, specifically kings that only reigned for 3 months, specifically kings that are only 18 years old, specifically kings that did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. But what's noteworthy is King Jehoiachin is considered through the book of Ezekiel as the last Davidic king to sit on the throne. And so here is the question. It's the question that in Psalm 89, the psalmist writes, God, are you going to keep your promise that you gave to David, that one day one of his sons would sit on the throne forever, how can you possibly keep that promise when there's no Davidic king sitting on the throne and the Davidic king has been taken off into exile and he's in jail in Babylon? Where is your former acts of love? The psalmist writes. And this is exactly where Ezekiel finds himself. Ezekiel is answering that question. Ezekiel answers, you are being judged by God because of your sin, but He's not done with you yet. He's going to kick you out of the land and judge you severely for your sin. And listen, chapter 4 through 24 are going to be very difficult chapters for us. The gravity and grossness of the sin of the people get put on full display for us. But God says, I'm not done with you yet. And He's going to make a promise of a new covenant to come and to deal with the sin of the people through His King, the Messiah. Last thing I'm going to do for us is I'm just going to run through 5 things real quick. 5 goals for our church family during this study of Ezekiel. Here are 5 goals for us. We are going to study Ezekiel because we want to behold the glory of God in His judgments and in His restoration. Catching a true glimpse of the backdrop of the judgment of God and the blackness of sin will allow us to behold the diamond of the salvation of Jesus Christ and to behold it as precious to us. Number 2, we as a church want to see our sin more clearly. We're not just going to read about the sin of others. We're going to read about sins that you and I have committed. Chapters 4 through 24 are hard chapters full of gloom, and there's only little bits of sparks throughout. There's only like 4 verses here and 3 verses there of any hope for the future that come through these 20 chapters. And we're going to look, and we're going to look again and again and again. Because as we look, what we're going to find is we're going to be looking in a mirror at ourselves. And we're going to be looking at the ways in which we have deserted our Savior, in which we have turned away and rebelled. All we like sheep have gone astray. There's no one righteous, no, not one. But then third, we as a church want to study Ezekiel because we want to comprehend what it means to be sojourners and strangers in exile. We need not just a Christianity that is a triumphant Christianity where everything is perfect. We need a Christianity that walks with God when things aren't perfect, when things are difficult, when things don't seem right. We need to know the answer to the question in that moment. Where is God? He is with you. He is with you, and He will not desert you. Number 4, we want to cherish the promise of God's plan. God's perfect plan included His judgments against His people for their sin, but it also includes incredible promises of hope. Chapter 36 and 37 are 2 of the most incredible chapters in the Old Testament. And it's incredible because we will walk through chapters 4 through 24. It will prepare us to explode in the glories of a promise of God that He's not going to leave the people in the old covenant that can't change their hearts. But He's going to come and He's going to sprinkle clean water on them, and He's going to put His Spirit within them, and He's going to rip out that heart of stone and put in a heart of flesh in them. And we want to be a church that prepares ourselves for that pinnacle and then celebrates as we see that promise. Finally, we want to be a church that finds hope in the midst of suffering. Where is God in the midst of His people's suffering? He is with them, and He is glorious. Would you pray with me?